Okay. Okay.
Okay. Super. Well, thank you so much, Tobias, and everyone at Interact in Bochum for having me. I'm really delighted to be here. So the way I've kind of structured this talk is I'm not just going to give an overview of what's in the paper. I thought that would be maybe not the most interesting route into it. So actually what I want to do is kind of brings like to the foreground kind of the concerns that really motivated thinking about how we should think about online sociality. And so I'm going to really focus on kind of, in some ways, like the framing that the paper that I've written with Dan Zahavi kind of focuses on. So this idea about how we should think about sort of offline interactions and online interactions, and really pushing at this idea that we should move beyond conceptualizing these things in terms of whether they can or can't replace or substitute one another. So I hope that's okay for everyone, and because I'm not just going to give a straight up summary of what was in the paper, so you got to go read it, which is a good pitch actually. So go read my paper. So this kind of just to give an overview, I've rather generously called kind of the substantive part of my talk my mini rant. Mini might not be a justifiable word to call it. I hope it isn't as ranty as I fear it is, but I thought I should be upfront about it. And really what I'm trying to do here is kind of just like explain why I think we need to go back and reconceive how we are doing particularly our phenomenological and our philosophical analyses of our online social encounters. So what I'm going to do is kind of present how I think people approach this topic typically, and I'm going to try and argue that we should move away from these kind of typical approaches and adopt my approach. So this is my like mini indoctrination talk, I guess. Then I'm going to run through a brief overview of the paper and kind of summarize the main points that Dan and I have put forward and how we should think about the way that technological mediation might alter some of our social encounters compared to face-to-face ones. And then what I'm going to finish up with, and this is kind of my pitch, I guess, is what I take to be as the framework that I'm trying to push forward, sort of going beyond this paper and into the work I'm currently doing on like what I think would be a good framework for kind of carrying out a robust and nuanced phenomenology of online social encounters. So that's what I'm aiming to do today. So where my interest really in like online sociality came from is this kind of very, very prescient and very prevalent concern that we hear a lot about at the moment, which is this worry that technology is ultimately just ruining our social lives. And this is something that we can find both in the media around us, but also it's seeping into some of the philosophy of online sociality that is out there. And you can also find it in sociological and anthropological discussions as well. So there's kind of a couple of like real main concerns about digital encounters that often get voiced. And these are things like when we encounter one another online, that it's a less meaningful encounter. The online interactions are like fundamentally kind of superficial, they're kind of thin. And then there's another common concern we get is that all that digital networks really are good for is kind of upping the quantity of social connections we have with one another. But what we're doing there is trading in kind of having like good quality, rich, robust encounters with other people. And the concern is based on one or other of these worries, that what we should be talking about is that even if technology kind of promises us easy social connectivity, ultimately what it's going to do is leave us alone and disconnected. Now, a very sort of prominent figure of someone who is, pretty worried about the role technology is playing in our social lives is Sherry Turkle, who's a really fantastic sociologist at MIT, who I spend a lot of time criticizing, even though bits of her work I think are really great. But a very key message in Sherry Turkle's work, particularly in her latest book, which is called Alone Together, She says the following. She says that networks, so when we go online, we are together, but so lessened are our expectations of one another that we feel utterly alone. And what she is pushing at in this book is she wants to ask, like, why on earth would we sacrifice our rich face-to-face interactions for what she describes as relationships with less? And she said that we're kind of lured in by this like quantity factor, that we think that we're going to be able to connect well, but ultimately we're kind of being duped by this like sales pitch from technology, and we end up with less. The nuance that I do think that's interesting in Sherry Turkle's work is that she doesn't stop at just saying that online social interactions are problematic. She also goes a step further. She says what we do when we go online is not only get poor social relations online, but that takes up time and degrades the kind of rich social relationships we might have offline. So she sees it as this kind of double bind, that it's not just that online is bad, but by opting for that, there's a sense in which we're going to degrade our offline relationships as well. Now, Sherry Turkle in lots of ways is, maybe a very obvious figure because she gives such a strong message warning against kind of the perils of going online. But this notion of like thinking about online interactions in terms of less is actually a very common way that we see philosophers thinking about online sociality. Maybe it would be important to note that while there's an awful lot of work on philosophy of technology, lots of work on philosophy of AI, things like data and digital ethics, that actually paying attention to just social encounters in and of themselves is still a relatively small field. And so I think that's why I'm able to make these more sweeping claims by saying that it's actually becoming quite typical to conceive of a sort of online sociality in terms of what online social interactions actually lack. So I want to kind of give an overview of, some of the kind of becoming common ways of thinking about what is lacking about sort of encounters that take place on the internet. I had originally sort of described everyone on here as kind of the pessimists with big scare quotes, but I took that out because I thought maybe that was a little bit over egging the cake, because some people are sort of worried about certain lacks that we find in online social encounters, but maybe don't go quite the whole hog as Sherry Turkle and say, therefore, we should never go online, or we should be very worried about going online. But what I wanted to start with is just giving an overview of some of kind of the common things that we see said about online social encounters. So a common one that we see is discussions about the reason why we should be worried about online social encounters is that when we go online, we lose perceptual access to others. Now, notably, this was a more common thing to say, 5-10 years ago, before the prevalence of things like Zoom, because a lot of people are talking about not being able to see one another. Now, obviously, it depends what platform we're on. And so those claims need to be nuanced in some ways. But there is still sort of this ongoing discussion about when we go online, we lose certain forms of perceptual access to others compared to when we're offline with one another. So, for instance, Mark Kearney has recently published a book about the role that touch plays and tactile perception is involved in our social encounters, and talks about how when we go online, there's a concern that this is missing. In the paper that Dan and I have written that was circulated before this talk, we call attention to the fact that we lose, smell when we go online. And while in phenomenology there isn't a lot of discussion about the role that smell might play in our social relations, there are some discussions that we find, and we might be concerned that when we go online and we focus very primarily on things like sight and sound, there might be aspects of our interpersonal encounters that are in fact important, but we have taken for granted and we haven't designed into our digital platforms, and they fall away. And we might want to conceive of this as a loss or in terms of a lack. So, as I said, quite a common thing that we see is people saying, well, our social encounters online are necessarily less perceptually rich than ones offline. Now, why might we be worried about things like this? Well, we might think that our perception across multiple, sensory modalities is playing a really important role in our social understanding and our social apprehension of other people. So often we see this cashed out in terms of the importance of being able to see, anticipate, react to the expressive behavior of other people. And the worry might be something along the lines of, if we've got less perceptual access, we're going to be much more open to getting, our social encounters wrong. We're going to have to do a lot of guesswork. We're going to have to, the way Thomas Fuchs describes it, like fill the gaps a lot if we have less sort of perceptual access to other people online. The person pictured here, this is Randall Collins, who's a sociologist, who also in a recent paper about the pandemic and online interactions also wants to say, well, the reason why we should be worried about having less perceptually rich access to other people when we go online is it's really important for establishing things like rhythm and turn taking. So Collins describes feedback, interpersonal feedback, as being really crucial to the successful participation and action of our social encounters. And he says that this is a really key ingredient that is there when we're physically together, and it allows us to monitor each other, and this is the key thing, in all perceptual channels. So again, he's emphasizing that even when we might talk about Zoom, when we have visual and maybe aural access to the others, we are still accepting a loss when we go online. Another concern that we often see about online social encounters is a point that I at least first saw made by Sarah Poulet at Jackson, who is, I don't know if I'm pointing in the right direction, but actually this demonstrates the point perfectly well. I saw in a paper by Sarah about this idea that we need to be a little bit more careful about not just talking about a loss of perceptual access. And she talks about Zoom, for instance, that, we can see one another. But what's actually problematic is that when we're trying to sort of understand others, engage with others, it's not just enough that we can observe their behavior, because when we go online, when there's more than two social participants involved, we also need to be able to see the directionality of people's gestures. So she talks about the way in which our expressions and gestures are orientated to one another. So an easy way to think about this is if someone, if two people entered the Zoom room right now and I waved at them, it might be the case that I'm in fact waving specifically at one of them, and it's really difficult to tell who I have directed my wave at or who I might be grinning at on Zoom. Whereas if I turn, I can now grin at Tobias, and he can see that I am directing that specifically at him as opposed to any of you. So I really like this kind of way of talking about it. So Jackson, and we might, draw other comparisons on other platforms, talks about the way that we might, lose orientation of our expressivity when we go online. This is Valeria Bizzari. She also talks about the way that when we go online, what we're going to miss out on is a kind of bodily resonance. So she's emphasizing, and very influenced by Thomas Fuchs's work here, that by the idea that in person, our embodied interactions affects one another. So again, it's moving away from this idea that we can just observe other people's interactions, but they matter to us because they affect us and we bodily respond to one another. And appealing to this idea that bodily resonance isn't just like a byproduct of social understanding. It's actually a really important part of how we socially understand one another, that we engage in things like coordination, mirroring, imitation, complementary behavior, that all of this is part of our sense making of a situation with other people. And what Valeria says, and again, we see this in other places as well, is that when we go online, it is not possible to enjoy an immediate corporeal resonance and an automatic inter-affective exchange when we're online. So again, it's conceived in terms of loss again. This is Thomas Fuchs. Valeria's work is very influenced by Thomas Fuchs's account, so there's a little bit of overlap here. But what Thomas Fuchs talks about, and he's drawing on kind of a rich phenomenological history of sociality here, is this idea that when we're offline, we empathetically grasp others through our embodied interactions. So again, he's pushing at this idea that we don't just observe other people to understand them, that we engage with them. It's an interactive, embodied process. And his concern is that when we go online, we're increasingly not engaging with a fully embodied other. What we're actually doing is just engaging with disembodied signs and symbols. Now, why is that a problem? He says it's just simply not the right kind of encounter for primary empathy, that for this sort of empathy with one another, this embodied social understanding, we have to be physically present with one another. And what he suggests is that when that is not happening, when we go online, when we are disembodied with one another, what we have to do is imaginatively construct what the other is thinking and feeling. So the way Fuchs describes it is that the other, and this is in the context of going online, has become a projection surface, a product of my imagination, indeed an object for my caprice. So the concern, and I think it depends how you read Fuchs's paper, and I go back and forth on this. Some days I'm more generous and some days I'm more grumpy about it. But there is definitely a line within Thomas Fuchs's paper where I think it seems to say that because when we go online, we are disembodied, according to Fuchs, and therefore primary empathy doesn't take place. And therefore, because we only have these signs and symbols, we don't actually encounter the other at all. All we can do is project and imagine and reconstruct another on the other side. So there might be a risk that not only is empathy lacking, but if the empathy is truly lacking in this way, we might not actually encounter the other online at all. And indeed, this paper that I'm referring to, which is called The Virtual Other, Fuchs actually concludes with this quite profound concern that if we actually replace all of our offline interactions with online ones, that ultimately we're going to lose our intersubjective horizons, our intersubjective life world. And why he's concerned with that is that he thinks that, like many other phenomenologists, that our whole notion of objectivity is grounded in intersubjectivity. So, that I perceive the world not only for me, but as also available for Tobias at this moment, or for any other person who would come in the room. And his concern is that if we go online, we no longer encounter embodied others, we may actually lose intersubjectivity and objectivity entirely. So it's a pretty big concern about, buying into this idea that maybe we should just embrace online social encounters. We also see discussions about a real fear that we'll lose shared worlds. It's a little similar to what I've just said about the conclusion of Thomas Fuchs's paper. We also see this in Norm Frieson's work, for instance, where he's emphasizing that when we go online, what we no longer share is physical space with one another. And he suggests that this can lead us towards a disruption of spatial coherence. So what does he mean by that? Well, he's saying that what happens is that when we go online, we no longer share our rich environments with one another, which can be problematic when it comes to referring to, me referring to something that's off screen, for instance. But I think the richer point, and the point that he's more interested in emphasizing, is that it also involves this kind of loss of what he describes as transitional spaces. So what he means by this is spaces that we occupy with other people that aren't per se instrumentalized. So the example he gives is he talks about going online for a Zoom meeting, for instance, and the way in which we can have a good flow of information and exchange. But at the end of the Zoom meeting, we just exit the room and no longer occupy space together. And he says what we lose are these transitional spaces where we would normally be walking towards the meeting space together. We'd walk back to our offices together. And he says that what happens when this kind of disruption of shared space happens is that we lose all of these really important features of our richer, more textured social lives. And so it's this idea, and this echoes things that we find in sort of Martin Heidegger's work, as well as in other places. Sherry Turkle also says this a lot in her writing, that when we go online, our interactions become kind of operationalized or instrumentalized. I feel I increasingly do work on philosophy that involves words I can't pronounce, so apologies if I stutter. So last one, I wanted to call attention to this point as well, because this is, again, this is something that's both raised by philosophers, but also by sociologists looking at technology as well, that there's this real concern. And again, remember, we're talking about kind of the pessimist camp about social encounters here that happen online. There's something that we lose when we go online with one another is a vulnerability in the face-to-face of one another. And this is very prominently argued by Hubert Dreyfus, who presumes that when we go online, we simply lack vulnerability with others. Now, why might that be important? Well, he suggests that when we go online with one another, and this is the presumption he starts his book with, this is on like page 4 of his book on the internet, that what we do is leave behind our emotional, intuitive, situated, vulnerable, embodied selves. No surprises, I have some problems with this presumption. And what he thinks is the problem is not just that this changes our social encounters, but he suggests that when this like very sense of vulnerability with one another is absent, our whole experience is sensed as unreal. He is drawing a lot on Levinas here, and he seems to basically imply that if it isn't in fact possible for me to punch you in the face, and I don't feel the real risk of that when we're face to face with one another, we lose that when if we lose that when we're online, there's a sense in which I just do not really feel you as being really present before me. It retains this kind of fictional, ethereal quality. I've kind of said this, so I'll just skip over this slide. So these I'm kind of tentatively describing as the pessimists, although I think that's a little bit of a broad brushstroke. But the idea really behind sort of people who are expressing this kind of concern about what online sociality lacks is this idea that technological mediation renders us disembodied, desituated, and disconnected. Now, why is this important, and why am I talking about this in terms of replacement? Well, these arguments are typically kind of weaponized or used to argue that we should resist the replacement of our rich offline social lives for ones that occur in the online sphere. We're going to turn to the optimist camp. This is a shorter bit because there's fewer optimists. It's very in vogue to be very pessimistic about online social encounters at the moment. But on the other end of the spectrum, we get those who think that we actually aren't very far away from a future where our entire social lives can move into the online sphere, and that technology is not that far away from being able to fully replicate our offline interactions. So David Chalmers' new book, Reality Plus, I think is an example of this. So in the beginning of his book, Chalmers is saying that as our technology improves, he says we may end up spending much of our lives in these virtual environments, whether for work, socializing, or entertainment. And this is the phrase that I'm particularly interested in, is that he makes the claim that within 100 years, he predicts that our virtual worlds are going to be indistinguishable from our non-virtual ones. Now, what I think is really interesting here is note that this doesn't involve necessarily denying the claims that are coming from like the pessimistic camp, but rather the claim is that these are contingent features of our current technology. These aren't necessary features of being technologically mediated with one another. They're just restraints or constraints that our current technology leaves us with. And all we have to do is just be patient. And all of this is going to be fixed with new and better technology. And the idea is that we should actively look forward to this replacement with offline and online. And there's a whole load of reasons why we should look forward to it. Some of them are such like the apocalypse is coming, guys, so we can all go online. Others are maybe slightly less motivated by fear of climate crisis, and are talking about things like accessibility, open opportunities. And we get kind of the optimism that really marked kind of the discussion of like the potential of digital societies back in the 1990s, where was this idea that actually once we get the technology that's good enough, we're going to have a really utopian society if we go online. Now, what I think is really interesting is that on the surface, we couldn't come up with much more polarized views, right? One side is extremely, extremely pessimistic about going online, to the point that they're worried that it is in fact degrading our offline interactions, as well as not providing us with good online interactions. And we've got the optimists that are saying, no, just be patient. Our tech will catch up. It'll all be great. But I think there's a commonality between these. There's kind of a shared presumption that both these camps share. Because both approaches seem to start with this, like, with this starting point, that the only way we can talk about online sociality in terms of being valuable is to the extent that it replicates or reproduces the kinds of social encounter that we actually have in our offline worlds. So I think what we find, even whether you're a pessimist or an optimist, as I've kind of classified it, that online forms of social encounter are evaluated based on how well they act as a perfect replacement or substitute for our face-to-face encounters. And my question is why? Now, what I want to do before kind of giving a quick summary of the paper is that I think there's 4 reasons that we should kind of reject the false dichotomy presented by this kind of offline versus online framing of thinking about and analyzing and engaging with online sociality. And what I'm going to try and pitch you on is that we need to move beyond the framework of replacement, replication, or substitution if we actually want to engage in like interesting and exciting phenomenological work on online sociality. Tobias, I have no idea. I know we started a bit late, but I wasn't sure how late, so wave at me if I'm rambling on. Okay, great. So I'm going to run through kind of 4 reasons why I think we should move beyond this framing of online versus offline, or thinking about online only as valuable to the extent that it can replicate what we do in our offline worlds. So the first is a practical point. I think that there is just like an unfortunate fallout of pitching offline versus online, which I think drives what I describe as kind of idealist claims on both sides. So I think we're kind of thinking about offline and online as being potentially in competition with one another and only valuable to the extent that they replicate one another, is that I think in the kind of pessimist sides of things, what this really drives is reaching for quite idealized notions of what it is to be physically co-present with one another. So I think that often what's kind of under the surface of lots of accounts that are saying, well, online we lose X, Y, and Z, is that they're reaching for quite reified or at least very specific understandings of what a good offline social interaction is. So often what is being said is online we lose things like good perceptual access to others, or we're suddenly no longer vulnerable with one another, or we don't have easy fluid bodily interaction. But what they seem to conveniently forget is that not all face-to-face encounters are in fact smooth, positive, valuable, successful, or even respectful instances of sociality. And I think when we pitch online versus offline as being, in competition with one another, I think we often see this kind of gloss of what offline sociality is, despite the extremely rich philosophical history we have of delineating all sorts of different kinds of social encounters. So I think that's a problem. I also think on the optimist sides that then what we see is a complete disavowal or disinterested in what we're currently doing. And there's these kind of vague hypothetical, gesticulations to what we might have. Like, don't worry, virtual worlds are going to be perfect. We're not going to be able to tell them apart. And so the arguments pitched from the optimist sides are then completely premised on the basis that we are going to, have this this technology that comes along. So I think we end up with this like kind of funny dichotomy where we only have perfect offline sociality talked about, and then we have online social encounters that don't currently exist, which just seems like a very weird way to try and get into like good philosophical work on how we currently encounter one another. So my worry is that we don't really end up engaging with philosophical questions about our current specific forms of online interaction. I think what we need to do is, if we're going to go, get into the business of comparing things like online interactions with offline ones, we need to be careful about how we start comparing things. So just as an example, if we're saying that, we really value things like intercorporeality and rich perceptual access, and we're basing this based on a dyadic conversation of, a conversation between two people who know each other very well, we're setting up a certain set of conditions that might not be very relevant to other forms of sociality, such as playing a game. So we don't want to say, well, online we lose X, Y, and Z, if actually what we're doing online is something different to what we were doing offline anyway. Or if we're saying the conditions that we need to set for online sociality being good are based in a dyadic conversation, ignoring the fact that when we go online, we might be doing something like playing a game. So I think we need to take more care when we're asking questions about what online sociality is like, and take more care when we're comparing it to what we do offline. Because there is no such thing as just offline sociality, right? That's an umbrella term for like a plethora, a myriad of social interactions. So the second reason is that I think this idea that online sociality is bad if it can't perfectly replace offline sociality, or that we should be striving for it to replace offline sociality, brings in some really problematic normative claims or problematic normative assumptions. So questions about whether online interactions can act as a perfect replica of offline interactions seems to suppose a neutral subjective experience. So what do I mean by this? Is that there is a presumption, and I'm putting these in scare quotes because I'm not sure how to quantify embodiment, but there's this presumption that fully embodied social encounters are, like, by necessity superior to less fully embodied ones. Or to put it another way, the assumption, oh no, that's meant to say offline sociality, sorry. The assumption is that offline sociality is the gold standard for everyone. And so that if anything happens online that is less than what happens offline, that means it is bad, it is worse. Now, what this ignores is that we don't have universal experience of offline social encounters. Might be the case that lots of kinds of offline social encounters are in fact not the gold standard for every single person. Some of us may specifically prefer or really thrive in certain online social spheres precisely because they are different to offline ones. So I wanted to talk this through in the notion of vulnerability. So just to remind you, so Dreyfus talks about how when we go online, we're no longer vulnerable with one another. And he says that that is fundamentally problematic because we don't experience the other person as real, and it undermines our social presence and our social understanding of one another. Now, first and foremost, it seems that he's starting with a very physical notion of what vulnerability is. So we might want to say, well, we're emotionally vulnerable to other people. There's lots of ways that we are in fact vulnerable with one another. So maybe we're just bringing in too narrow a notion of vulnerability here. But I think the more important, or at least the point that I think is more important, is that I think that there is a certain privilege in assuming that vulnerability is in fact necessary for good social encounters, for rich social encounters to unfold. Because what it ignores is how real world vulnerability can undermine our social encounters in certain instances. So it ignores the fact that certain people experience real threat of violence, abuse, and discrimination in the physical co-presence of others. And when that happens, there is a breakdown of interpersonal understanding, there is a breakdown of recognition, and there is a breakdown of respect. And so I think that there's something to be thought about in a little bit more detail here, is that the kind of vulnerability that Dreyfus, and I think by implication also Levinas, are talking about is like a vulnerability that is cashed out in a certain privilege, where it's not so vulnerable that you're going to dehumanize me because of, say, my gender or my race or my, my physical embodiment, for instance. So I think we should be careful about bringing some of these notions sort of wholesale into our discussions about online sociality. And the point is that social interaction is normatively structured, and this is not always going to benefit everyone. We can prefer, we can be supported by, we can flourish in different sorts of social interactions depending on who we are. And when we go online, differences from the offline norm may lead to the benefit for certain people. So just as a couple of examples, we might think about individuals who actually find being physically present with other people very sensorially overwhelming, for instance. So we can think about autistic individuals, individuals who suffer from cerebral palsy, or individuals who have social anxiety disorder, who actually say that achieving smooth, intercorporeality, smooth bodily interaction, engagement with other people is really difficult when they're physically face-to-face with other people. And being physically face-to-face with others, in fact, again, undermines social understanding, undermines experiences of connection with one another. We might also think about how autistic individuals often are not given kind of the temporal space they need to respond to everyday social encounters. So there's some really fantastic work that is really pushing against this idea that autistic individuals do not respond in, lots of scare quotes here, sort of normal ways in social encounters. And there's been some really great research that says actually what often happens is that autistic individuals take slightly longer than normal, scare quotes, normal, to respond. And neurotypical individuals simply do not give them the temporal space to actually respond. So we might think that when we go online, for instance, and there is an extension or an expansion of how long we expect someone to respond in, that this could work to the benefit. Now that's really important, right? Because we're precisely saying that some people are going to benefit because online is different, not because it's a perfect replica, but precisely because of the opposite, that it is in fact not a perfect replica. And I just wanted to flag the work here of Anna Borteland, so Anna's at the top here, who's doing work precisely on social anxiety and how going online might be beneficial for certain individuals with social anxiety. And underneath this is David Ekdahl, who's doing a really great project at the moment about autistic individuals and online sociality. I've recently heard talks from both of them, and they're exactly driving at this point that maybe we need to, revel in the difference of online sociality rather than assess it in terms of it being lacking. I think I kind of said this, so I'm going to skip over this. I think the other concern, and Tobias and I were talking about this when we went for coffee earlier, is that again, this whole setup of can online sociality adequately replace offline sociality might be just a poor misconstrual, right? Baked into this very notion of replacement is the implication that we're going to have to give something up. I've changed this. Tobias pointed out that in the article, Dan and I actually have written this wrong, but I've changed it for the slide. But, baked into this notion of replacement is if, I'm going to replace drinking coffee with drinking tea, I'm no longer going to drink coffee. If someone's replaced at work, the new person takes over and the old person leaves. So my worry about this word replacement is it's quite triggering, right? Because if we're talking about can online sociality replace offline sociality, we've kind of baked into our whole discussion the idea that we're going to have to give something up, that we might not get back our offline styles of interactions, that we're going to, embrace digital sociality at the expense of offline social encounters. So I think the very framing itself as kind of an exchange kind of sets us up for being concerned that we are necessarily going to lose something because it's an either or. And I kind of want to say, but couldn't it be an and? And I think that we have to be a little careful here because there are ways in which we might still think there are going to be some trade-offs, right? It seems that there's a time trade-off. If I suddenly start, I go from a world where I've never used online social interactions at all, and I start using them, I am going to be taking time away from offline social interactions. So it's, in some sense, there is going to be, maybe we're going to give up some offline sociality if we're engaging with online sociality. I think maybe the more interesting one is that if we go online, we might start changing our social habits, our social norms, and our social ways of engaging. So remember what Sherry Turkle said at the beginning is that her worry isn't just that online social encounters aren't very good or very rich, but if we're carrying around our phones constantly, going for lots of social connections online, that what I give up is being present with people when we're, sitting around the dining room table with one another. So we might be concerned that if we go online, it's going to shape our overall habits of sociality. Now, I think that is a concern, but I think that we should also point out that we already, as I pointed out, we don't just engage in offline sociality, right? We engage in multiple kinds of offline sociality. And we are quite good at transferring our social skills to different occasions. So the way I act in a work meeting is not the way that I act with my parents, and it isn't the way that I would act if I was going to go and, I was going to say play a tennis match. I don't play tennis, so I don't know why I would be using that. But we deploy different habits already. And so maybe this concern about habits is also kind of underpinned by the idea that we're not actually treating our online social encounters as something different, as something that we should have different habits around, different norms, different values. So actually this worry about habits itself could be that if we're just using our online social habits offline, maybe we're still making a mistake of thinking of these as substitutable, and actually having a richer engagement with how these are different is actually going to help us not deploy our social habits in bad moments. And then the last one is this, and this is kind of just my final grumpy point on why I think we should move beyond replacement, is that I just have this sneaking suspicion that if all we're really aiming to do is design technology to create a perfect replica of offline sociality, we're going to lose ways and lose sight of ways in which we can creatively design different ways of being together. And as I've just said, there's not lots of normative reasons why I think we should resist that. I think we should embrace the difference. I think we should be open to thinking about how we can benefit many different people, not just adopting, the normative majority offline and just superimposing it into how we think about online. But also just from a creative point of view, it literally seems like the least interesting way of thinking about how we might want to design technology. If all we're striving to do is create online worlds that perfectly replicate offline ones, that seems like kind of a sad place to have ended up. So that's my rant over. Sorry, it was a longer rant than I realized. So all of this was prefaced on this idea that what I think has happened or is increasingly happening in discussions of online sociality is that online sociality, as I've said, is only being valued to the extent that it can be seen as perfectly replacing or perfectly replicating offline. Now, what Dan and I tried to do in this paper was move away from thinking about this in terms of, does it perfectly replicate? Is it a perfect substitute? But rather just think about these in terms of alterations, because that means we can think about what might be specific or nuanced about online sociality. Whether it's good or not is then a judgment that comes afterwards. We need to do good phenomenological work to consider what sort of social encounters are happening before we should move into the second stage and say, well, is this a loss? Like, is this a lack? Is this problematic? Or reverse, is this in fact healthy? Is this doing something useful for us? And what we did in the paper is we tried to explore kind of 5 different themes through which we can think about sort of the alteration of our social encounters online. I'll keep this kind of brief because some of this is going to echo some of the discussion we've already had. But the first theme we wanted to talk about, again, is this perceptual access point. And rather than just starting with the idea that, okay, well, we lose certain things when we go online, is to start with the first question, like, do we have perceptual access to others when we're on something like Zoom? Are we engaging, as Fuchs says, in disembodied signs and symbols? There's often this presumption about what the structure is about our online social worlds, whereas we've got rich phenomenological work to do. Like, do I see you? I think so right now. I think that the idea that I'm just looking at an image is just often phenomenologically not the case. I don't experience you as a moving picture. I experience myself as having access to you. What was my point here? I'm just looking at my own bullet points. I can't remember. But I think, and in doing this rich work, I think what's interesting is that then we can kind of draw attention to what might not be there. But an important question again is like, is this just contingent, right? Like, is this a necessary feature of our digital mediation? And again, this is what the worry I think I have about discussions about perceptual access is it seems very much like technology cannot do this for us. Now, lots of these things are going to reflect often not just the design features of various platforms, but also our social etiquettes around them. I'm going to move on from this point because I've lost my train of thought, so I'm just going to move on. The second theme that we talk about is intercorporeality. And so again, we want to like do justice to the fact that often it does seem that like there is something to be said that there are certain constraints on the kinds of bodily interactions we can engage with on online platforms. It seems at the moment that the way our worlds are designed, I couldn't engage with like certain forms of collective action with you all on Zoom right now, such as like moving the table in front of me, or being able to reach out and shake your hand. There do seem to be certain ways in which our, bodily coordination is limited, not least because you can only see me from the top up at the moment. And again, Sarah Jackson's nice point about orientation, like these do seem potentially ways that there are certain alterations when we go online. But I think we should be careful about stopping our analysis at this point. Again, we've got this contingency point, right? That just because you can only see me from the, I was going to say from the boobs up, I guess that is true. You can only see me from the waist up. That's the more professional way of putting it. Is because of the way where I'm engaging with you based on like my webcam and my laptop. Like we could envisage a Zoom setup where suddenly whole walls of our conferences are set up such that we can actually engage in a much more obviously embodied, like fully embodied interaction with one another, where we can see how people are moving, not just from the waist up, but see them walking around rooms. These are contingent factors about what we currently are using our technology for. But I think there's also, and again, like I suspect this is, or I at least think this is the more interesting case, is that while we might think of these in terms of constraints or limitations, I think to do so is also to overlook the way that we actually engage in very creative practices online that are just different. And again, this isn't about substituting, these are different ways of engaging. So I don't know, I included this example because it's something I do a lot. Maybe I should admit this, but if I know someone that I am in a conference room in, typically I am texting them on another, technological medium so that I can in fact orientate both their and my bodily gestures towards one another. If I have just texted something to my friend and they smirk on Zoom, I know that is orientated to me because we have structured it in such a way such that we can build up this rich intercorporeality with one another. And again, I think if we start off by thinking about, well, it just lacks these things, we're going to miss out on these textured and creative practices that lots of us are engaging with that seem to be really not talked about in the literature. We also need to be really careful about the platforms we're talking about, right? And I know that I kept bringing up gaming in the paper with Dan, as because lots of the things that are talked about as lacking, it seems that gaming virtual worlds might be a bit of a counterpoint to, because it seems like when we game with one another, and David Ekdahl again has done really fantastic work on this, there's ways in which we can coordinate our avatars, we can jointly attend to things in games, we can engage in kind of collective activity of killing hordes of other gamers basically, and so we might think about again, not just in terms of constraint, but how we engage in different forms of intercorporeality on different platforms. We then wanted to talk about shared space. And again, it was kind of emphasizing once again that we want to do due justice to the richness of our social encounters. I think there's a lot to be said about the fact that we do need to pay attention and think about this when we're talking about online sociality. That our interactions with others are not just meaningful because there is an other, but often because we're in shared embedded environments together. So this is where an awful lot of our social encounters in terms of joint attention, joint action, shared emotions, often we're directing ourselves towards the world together. And there might be a concern that when we go online, that we are not, physically present in the same physical environment. But again, if this is where we stop our analysis, we're going to completely ignore the ways that we can create and share space online. Like right now, we are, I hope, if I haven't bored you all silly, we are all jointly attending to my slides. Like I can point to Dan's picture, for instance. Like there is a way in which, even if this isn't physical space, we can coordinate and create meaning in an embedded online social world. And the fact that you can't see what's going on in the windows outside isn't super meaningful, right? I'm not attending to what's going on outside, and you having access to that at this moment doesn't seem that as salient as the fact that we can create shared and joint attention by using things in the online sphere. And again, gaming worlds seem like a really good case in point for this. So again, what we were trying to do here is strike a balance where we're acknowledging that there might be differences, but if you start with lack, you often end up, like, I think there is just this risk that you stop your analysis too soon. You don't look at what else we might be doing. Is this? Oh no, 2 more points. And then I promise I will stop because I think I've massively overrun. We also wanted to talk about transitional space. So this is again referring to Frieson's work about transitional space and this instrumentalization. And again, I think this can happen, but I don't think it has to. I think that this is I think it's extrapolating from one use of online sociality. And we find this often, that people really focus on the way that we do Zoom meetings or like work meetings with one another, where there is arguably an instrumentalization going on, whether we're online or offline anyway. But actually, these aren't necessarily necessary features. We don't have to instrumentalize others or our time with others online. And so one of the examples I was thinking about precisely where we might not only create but enjoy transitional spaces with other people online are examples from the pandemic. So I don't know if this resonates with anyone, but during the pandemic, my sister and I used to put Zoom on and just leave it on all day. And like I would get on and do my work. We often wouldn't be directly interacting with one another. We were often doing our own things. She'd have the joy of potentially being able to watch me, do yoga and clean my apartment. But we set it up so that we could, in fact, share transitional space, this kind of betweenness with one another, create this shared world where we both had, a portal toward into each other's lives. And so again, I think if we start from this lack, we fail to take into account these more creative ways in which people might be using technology, not the way it's set up to be used, because these are finding ways of creating these things with one another. I'm going to leave the self-presentation one because I think it's the least interesting anyway. So what we wanted to kind of argue then is that we're just not going to do justice to our online social encounters if we're conceptualizing them in terms of what they lack. I've said all of this, so I'm just going to skip over it. Or if we conceptualize them purely in terms of what we hope might happen when our technology is better. And what we concluded with is that what we really need to do is actually engage with a phenomenology of online sociality that's going to examine our online social encounters without bringing in these presumptions about what a good or what a useful social encounter is, or what a social encounter should look like. And again, not just thinking about, whether certain things are lacking, maybe the richer way is to think how certain, rich notions of sociality, what the limits of them might be. It might not be that intercorporeality is lacking. It might be that there might be certain constraints on it. So bringing in that important nuance and being sensitive to new forms and styles of encounter. So I'm just going to finish. I promise I've got 2 more slides and they'll be quick. So I just wanted to finish with pointing towards in a more positive light, because I think a lot of what I've said has sounded like me being quite grumpy. But what I want to kind of push us towards is moving away from statements that look like this, that the internet is either good or bad for sociality, because I think there are 3 really important things that we need to dissect. 1, the internet. We encounter each other and we engage with each other in extremely different ways depending on the platform we're on. I don't think that we should be making claims about intercorporeality or space about the internet. I think we need to be much more specific. I think we need to differentiate the use of Zoom from the use of instant messaging platforms, from things like Twitter, from TikTok, from Instagram. These are all designed in different ways. They're different social spheres. They give us access to each other in different ways. So I think we need to be platform specific. I think we cannot talk about full sociality. I think we need to be action and intention specific here as well. Are we talking about being able to engage or perceive other people? Are we talking about being able to, jointly attend to things? We are talking about engaging in collective action. Are we talking about feeling togetherness with other people? Are we talking about experiences of social identity? These are all examples of sociality. So we shouldn't just be sticking the word sociality on without having, a sensitive approach to what we're actually doing in online encounters and what we're aiming to do in them. And then this good bad, I think we have to be user specific. I don't think we should be assuming a universal user. I think we should be thinking about who is using that specific platform, what they're using it for, and how it might benefit or harm them based on who they are, how they also engage with things like offline sociality and the differences, whether they're good or bad. So what I really want to push for is this idea that our analyses of digital social spaces need to be platform specific, user sensitive, and social interactions specific. So the framework that I think we should be starting with, if we want to engage in a rich and nuanced phenomenology of online sociality, is prefaced by these 3 questions. I think we should be asking how we encounter others on digital platforms, on different digital platforms. I think we should be looking at what kinds of social interactions various digital platforms scaffold, shape, and sustain. And I think we should be asking who these various styles of interaction might benefit, harm, or hinder. And I think if we start with this framework rather than online versus offline, I think we're going to be able to engage in much more nuanced, much more interesting, and maybe most importantly, the most socially useful way of showing that philosophy can contribute in a very rich manner for thinking about the role that the internet and other technological devices should have in our social worlds. And that's everything. Sorry, I massively overran.
Thank you very much. I stopped recording.